Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this conference. It's a true pleasure to be here. My beginnings in linguistics in general, in fact, started at the CALS conferences that were held at that time in Opatija. So it's lovely to be back to the Rijeka leadership of CALS that has been gone for a while and is now back here. So what I'll be talking about today are the individual and collective factors in metaphor that I will recast as local and global factors in metaphor. And I'll start with a short example from a recent research of mine that I have done, and that's dealing with nations and plants. Well, the research itself was about nation, but here are a couple of metaphors with plants. So if you look at these metaphors, cvijet Hrvatske nacije, literally the flower of the Croatian nation, and us weeds. And another example where we talk about a nation as being withered, odsvala. What we would primarily say in a conceptual view of the language is that such examples suggest a rich conceptual arrangement whereby nations in fact are conceptualized as plants. The different grammatical and discursive factors are largely taken as secondary in these examples. What is crucial here is the fact that this is a conceptual metaphor that connects these things. This conceptual metaphor, as we have heard yesterday, in fact, later becomes neural metaphor as well as conceptual metaphor through primary and then neural theory as well. So this view assumes that metaphor, in fact, is a global phenomenon. What is shared and global is taken as crucial. What is conceptual is taken as crucial and is taken as cognitively real. What is individual and local, then, is to some extent, in certain cases, seen as an epiphenomenon, something that only happens because it happens, so to speak, but because of the large conceptual framework. So what I will be talking about, what I will be pleading for today is the locality of metaphor. The fact that the local, I'll be saying that the local perspective is in fact primary, and that we in our research of metaphor should not underestimate the local perspective. And in fact, I will claim that to some extent what we see as globality is in fact just a sum of local conceptualizations, but it is perceived as natural post hoc because of cultural salience, hegemonic framings, etc. So here's the overview of what I'll be doing. First of all, I'll say a little bit about these global perspectives in metaphor theory. Then I'll talk a little bit about framing, which is started in conceptual metaphor and then turned into discursive metaphor. Then I need to say something about global and local factors as Kovačić sees them, and then I'll turn into my research and say something about the way in which I see the local element in metaphor through four elements: linguistic elements, constructions, metaphor clusters in discourse, and recontextualization. And I'll end with an example of what I want to call therapeutic function of metaphor, i.e. metaphor that is primarily effective in essence. So here are some global perspectives in conceptual metaphor. Metaphorization in the classical conceptual metaphor theory is taken as a shared cognitive ability which is based on conceptual and neural commonalities, and there are mappings between what we would call two conceptual domains, the source domain and the target domain, and metaphors are based on the embodied as well as the culturally shared element. However, the embodied element very often is, the primary one, the one that we start out with. Later on, it became a little bit less important, and socio-cognitive grounding gained importance. And all of this is connected to a notion of primary metaphors, and these primary metaphors are based on certain shared primary scenes, like the one that Christina, in fact, described yesterday. And these scenes are seen in conceptual metaphor theory as largely universal. So if you look at a variety of examples, this goes back to the same example of nations and plans. This time it's example of vision. We see a variety of linguistic expressions such as the light of discovery, Rex turning a blind eye to something, pulling wool over somebody's eyes, a veil of ignorance, etc. What we are doing here then, if we look at it from conceptual metaphor theory view, we are connecting aspects of vision or light to aspects of understanding, and one of these things happens in language, the other one happens in thought. These are interconnected and cannot be divided from itself. So what I will be arguing, in fact, is that the linguistic part of it is also very, very important, more than anything else. So in these global perspectives, in conceptual metaphor, in initial formulations, in fact, any sort of innovation that you had in, say, literary work and other things were taken as primarily conceptual in essence, right? So what this means is that innovation that happened in examples such as two roads diverged in a wood, which is basically life is a journey metaphor, come from the fact that we know this metaphor, but it was only either linguistically innovative or conceptually innovative through extension, elaboration, questioning, combining, and other things. So life is a journey then is a conceptual metaphor that we all share with some sort of an innovative formulation. This is basically a global view then. Creativity is based necessarily on conceptual mechanisms, and the local is the result of these conceptual mechanisms more than anything else. Now I want to turn to framing in discourse simply because it connects very well with this innovation. So what happens in these innovative metaphors is that if we look at them, they allow us to see the world, so to speak, in a new way almost, right? Seeing the world, that's, you know, going back to old literary theory, Shklovsky would call it astranение, which estrangement, I guess, in English, or whatever it is, I forget. So anyway, this is a new view of the world, so to speak. But this new view of the world, in fact, is not something that necessarily happens in literature only. It happens in discourse, and this is precisely what Leiko has seen and talked about in his books about political discourse. So when metaphors appear in discourse, they are very often, for instance, political discourse, they are used as framing devices, devices that allow us to see the world in a different way. They are what Goffman would call schemata of interpretation, the way to interpret the world. They are instructions as to how to interpret the world. So for instance, if we have, and this is Leikov's example, something like tax relief, that means that tax is seen as an affliction, right? So if you use tax relief in democratic versus republican political discussions, if you take this frame, then that means that regardless of who you are, you're framing the discussion in this relief sort of way, right? So you're using this to influence somebody's point of view almost. So this is why framing is important, and innovative framing can happen as well. So framing then is seen as a global conceptual device as well. However, when we look at details of how metaphors appear in discourse, we can also see that there are more local, contextual characteristics of metaphor. So before I go into my view of these local contextual characteristics, I just want to say that in fact Kovačić in 2015, after many formulations of conceptual metaphor theory, where he in fact tried in many ways to bring together everything that has been happening in conceptual and then later neural metaphor theory, he gives a model whereby there are local and global contextual factors. So he starts out with the global context, which is most important to him, which includes the situational context, the discourse context, the conceptual cognitive context, and the bodily context. And local contexts are basically the same. These are local pressures of some sort that pressure the way in which metaphor is used in a particular discourse. So what is important here, so keep this in mind, and I'll give just a couple of things about this model. What is important here is that he believes that embodiment is the dominant factor. So despite the fact that these are four different things that seem of the same size, so to speak, he believes that the bodily context, in fact, and explicitly says it in his book, is the one that is predominant, very important. Secondly, he believes that the conceptual system and discourse function as context. So he recasts the conceptual and the discourse is context anyway, but the conceptual as context, right? He recasts this as context to be able to do this neat thing. Secondly, he finds it necessary to invoke stable conceptual metaphors. And fourthly, he believes that there is some sort of a local context that pressures metaphor use, and these are these sorts of things that we see here, right? So what I will be claiming is, well, maybe not inside out. I put down locality metaphor works from the inside out, but maybe not from the inside out, but going back to those arrows, both ways at least, right? At least both ways. And discursive local pressures bring about a fiction of globality in certain cases. It's not that they necessarily need to be real. It goes back to the issue of familiarity that we talked about before. It's not necessarily that they need to be real, but we see them as such simply because we are familiar with them. And I will show this, I'll try to show this on 4 examples. First of all, I'll start with certain linguistic elements where I will claim that constructions matter. Being a cognitive linguist, a cognitive grammarian, and a constructional linguist, constructions must matter, otherwise nothing else does. Secondly, I'll talk about constructions mattering conceptually as well, to some extent. Thirdly, I'll talk about the fact that metaphors cluster in discourse. So that there are metaphor clusters, it seems, which also is a local sort of thing. And fourthly, I'll talk about recontextualization, reusing other people's metaphors that goes back to framing and political discourse, etc., in contexts that are not necessarily hegemonic, which actually create what I call emotional, what I refer to as emotional styles. So let's start with these linguistic elements, local elements in metaphor, linguistic elements, the fact that constructions matter. So in the classical CMT view, linguistic elements such as grammar are largely seen as relatively insignificant in conceptual metaphor. The fact that we see all of those examples, what is crucial about them is that they are conceptual rather than how they are actually said linguistically, how they are actually expressed. So the fact that we have cvijet hrvatske nacije, the flower of the Croatian nation, noun plus noun genitive, or odsvala nacija, where it's an adjective plus noun, are both based on the same conceptual metaphor, nations are plants. However, metaphors in fact vary if you look at them in discourse. On 2 levels. I've divided it up into 2 levels, but they're both constructional levels. So on the one hand, they vary in word forms. Some are simply more metaphorical than others. And secondly, they also vary in grammatical constructions. Certain grammatical constructions, depending on the particular concept, will be more metaphorical, or more likely to be metaphorical than some others. So let's look at word forms first. So here is a simple example from Croatian. In Croatian, you've got the noun bol, pain, which can be both masculine, and then you've got bola, bolovi, or feminine, and then you've got boli, boli, right? So if you look at these two forms, bolovi versus boli, and look at them through the corpus of, I used Hrvat for this, what you find is that in this particular construction, I've only used one construction here just for the purpose of showing it to you. What happens is that these are bolovi and these are boli. This is what is shared, and here you've got no boli, and here you've got no bolovi or less of them anyway, to some extent. So if you look at it, in fact, and there are some examples here, they're simple examples, bolovi tends to be largely non-metaphorical. Bolovi su u mišićima, leđima, kičmi, in your muscles, back, lower back, chronic, menstrual. And boli, please note that I haven't made a distinction between the singular and the plural in both of those cases yet. So, are largely metaphorical. So, boli u duši, for instance, u dubokoj boli, duševne boli, pretrpljene boli, etc. And this is just a short example of this, but case studies like these have been made for English and for Croatian, in fact, and they show, for instance, the most famous ones are the ones by Danon. They show, for instance, that it seems certain specific forms that are a little bit different from the citation form that tend to be metaphorical, and that citation forms tend to be more default and less metaphorical, or at least divided in half, something to that effect. Okay. So on the one hand, we've got these word forms, but on the other hand, we can also look at grammatical constructions. And I'll be using just 4 grammatical constructions that I've looked through from the point of view of cognitive grammar. So I've looked at the adjectival premodifier construction, such as, for instance, velika nacija, large nation, which is in fact a thing like construction in cognitive grammar terms. What this means is that the premodifier locates the noun in a conceptual space, and it is defined by the adjective. The adjective, in fact, describes the noun according to a characteristic that is somehow intrinsic to it. Please note that there are, in fact, 2 types of adjectives, and I'm only talking about one type here. Not all adjectives are necessarily like this. So scalar adjectives tend to be more like this, and then there are some others that are simply different. Then you've got the genitive construction, such as, for instance, otac nacije, which is in fact a relational construction. What we are doing is we're using the genitive to show the relation between these 2 nouns. What this relation exactly is, we don't know. So if you look at Croatian grammars, for instance, you'll see a list, long lists of what all genitive can do, and these things that the genitive can do have some certain things in common, and that is quite obvious. So some genitive relations, in fact, tend to be more salient than some others: part-whole relations, material relations, position relations, family relations, etc. So what's going on here is that, in fact, the genitive functions as the reference point locating the trajectory. So the genitive, which is nacije, functions as a way to go towards otac here. That's the idea here. And a couple more constructions before I get to the data. One is when you have a trajectory of a verb. So this we would call something like the first participant of a verb. So when you've got any sort of a sentence, you can have, in cognitive grammar terms, you can have the first participant and the second participant. The first participant largely corresponds to the agent in traditional semantic terms, but not necessarily completely, not necessarily always. So So this trajector is in fact the most prominent entity, and this most prominent entity is the primary focus of attention, the locus of attention, which is being located, evaluated, described by means of a verb. So in an example, that would be something like nacija može something, or something to that effect. And in a landmark construction, which is what we would call a second participant construction, i.e. a typical theme, that sort of thing. You can say, for instance, to sell the nation. In this, landmark is the secondary focal participant. Something can sell it, right? That's what we are saying, right? And this second participant, in fact, tends to be, in Lanneker's terms, downstream from the trajector. So if we look at these four constructions, and if we look at words such as nacija, nation, that can appear in all of these constructions, and if we look at how many of these are in fact metaphorical, we get the following picture. So if you look at all of them, you can see that for the nation, there tends to be more genitive and more trajector constructions than all of the other constructions. And in fact, I haven't put it here, but in fact, if you look at it from the point of view also of what the ratio of these constructions is on, it's basically the same. So I haven't put the slide up here. So the genitive and the trajector here seem to be better suited, at least for the nation concept, to be metaphorical. But then if we turn to a different concept, such as, for instance, one that is typically taken in cognitive linguistics, and that's the concept of anger, right? So I use the word ljutnja in Croatian. We see a different picture. We see the landmark construction and the trajector construction, but we don't see as much of the genitive construction here anymore. Right? So you've got a blind anger, you've got sharpness of anger, you've got anger will subside, you've got stirring up anger, fanning anger. All of these are examples of these various constructions. So trajector and landmark tend to be better suited. So I just did a very quick comparison between the two, and in fact what you find is that nacija is obviously different than ljutnja here. But then, if you look at it, ljutnja is also different than bijes, which bijes is rage. So if you wouldn't expect it, they would be in the same conceptual field. Why would they be different, right? That's the idea. And in fact, all of these are statistically significant. So it seems that different metaphorizations depend on the concept and on the grammatical construction of that concept. These two are in interplay. We cannot only look at one, we need to look at the other as well. At least. In fact, what you can see here, and I haven't reported on it here, but I'll say something about it later. In fact, if you look at the four anger words in English, anger, rage, wrath, and what was fury. So if you look at these four, in fact, you will see that anger is in fact the least metaphorical. It's the default conceptualization, it's the least metaphorical in ratios. And all of the others are metaphorical, and they specialize on some aspect of anger, of the anger scenario, what Kovačić would call the anger scenario. So these are local conceptualizations rather than global ones, right? These depend on local factors. And we can go even one step further. In fact, if we look at all of these constructions, so verb constructions, I put down together the trajector and landmark constructions. This is from a different study, and I couldn't divide them up for this talk. But and these are relational noun of noun constructions. These are pre-modifier constructions. You can see that the various metaphors, various conceptualizations appear differently, and it's the relational constructions that have most different metaphors. And the pre-modifier construction, which is thing-like, has the least metaphors. I claim in this particular paper that these least metaphors appear here because they are the ones that are it may sound counterintuitive, but they are closest to the actual prototype, so to speak, of the concept where we are. The further you are, the more you can do, so to speak. Yeah. So the grammatical or the conceptual follows the grammatical in this sort of view. Right. So overall, constructions matter. Different constructions have different metaphorical potential and, in fact, different metaphors. And these seem to be local, constructional elements that determine metaphor. And the reasons for this can be different. Different metaphors work better in different grammatical constructions. What the metaphor frames needs to coincide with the construction to some extent, right? Relational patterns allow most metaphors. The further away they are, the more relational they are, the more metaphors they allow. So trajectory, landmark, and then genitive versus premodification. So this is quite obvious. In fact, if you look at what metaphor is and how we showed it, two different domains, that's a relational way of showing it, right? The more relational you can be, the more metaphorical you can be, almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then, as I said before, differences between words within the same domain also appear, and they depend on, and that's something that I've shown in a different paper that I haven't discussed here, is that they depend on the salience of the word. So anger is the most salient one, and it tends to have the most default conceptualizations, which in fact are in half-half as far as metaphoricity is concerned. They also depend on certain morphosemantic properties that I can't discuss here, etymology and other factors. Okay, so we've established now that constructions matter, but what I want to claim next is that constructions in fact matter conceptually. And what I mean by this is to look at how these metaphors combine, how these linguistic expressions combine, and what sort of metaphorical potential you can get if you look at it even more locally than we have looked at so far. So if we look at an example such as Otac nacije, the father of the nation, which is a male person to be credited with having an important role in the nation building process. This is used obviously of someone in retrospect generally. Once the nation has been successfully built, also a metaphor. So there are other conventional uses in Croatian that do not necessarily refer to nations. There are fathers of psychoanalysis, theories, the father of history, of a project, of perestroika. All of these are these hegemonically male persons who have some sort of credit for establishing one of these things. So if we look at Otac nacije versus Otac psychoanalyze, what we can see is that both of them are based on some sort of creation, but the creation is different in fact. And it needs to be necessarily in line with the target domain concept, which one would expect as per the invariance hypothesis that Lakoff and others formulated. So the family metaphor for both of these is necessarily different. They are simply different families. In fact, psychoanalysis has no metaphorical children or mothers. The expression is conventional. It's never questioned. If you look at the corpus, I looked at the corpus for this example, it's never questioned or played with in the corpus. It's always this conventionalized expression referring to a single person. It needs to be that. There's nothing else there in Hrvatsko, at least. I looked at all of the examples in Hrvatsko. However, the nation has a relatively full family structure, and it is regularly exploited in a variety of ways. Here are some examples. Do we need a father of the nation, or has Croatia come of age and can manage without a father? Right? So you see the playing behind it. Speaking of a father of the nation, because instituting an immature bastard as a potential father of the nation is destructive. Right? That's refers to one of Croatian politicians. And look at this one, this is my favorite. Reproductive potency of the father of the nation, right? So why does Croatia need to have a father and nobody else needs to have a father, right? So all of these are games, you know, linguistic and discursive playing, but this playing is sanctioned by this local conceptualization called up by the nation frame here. And in fact, you've got majke, sinovi, kćeri, bratske nacije, djeca nacije, etc. So all the entire family structure works very well for nations, as opposed to psychoanalysis, where it doesn't. And a similar thing happens for in a variety of ways, different ways. For example, such as puls javnosti, puls grada, puls nacije, puls tržišta, or homogenizirati naciju, portfelj, desnicu, javno, sustav. So all of these in these different domains, in fact, will be different and will have different metaphorical potential in this sense. So if I look through the nation corpus, and there are 49%, so half of such examples where this lexical schematicity works different in different things that are used, right? So you know, almost half of it is local in this sense. That's the idea here. So different constructions have different conceptual corollaries, even within the same source domain, which is a local factor. And this is evident in different patterns of use in discourse. And what I want to turn to now is these patterns of use in discourse. So when we look at metaphors in discourse, what we find is that metaphors in discourse tend to cluster. This was noticed first, I think. This was noticed by Cameron in her study of classroom discourse in 2003. But then later on, it was very nicely talked about by Kimmel, who actually showed that metaphors tend to appear in mixed clusters when they are in discourse. So metaphors, the title of his paper is something like Metaphors Mix and Mix Well, or something like that. I forget anyway. But the idea here is that it's not only nation metaphors or family metaphors that appear, but different metaphors about nation. I'm sorry, not nation metaphors, family metaphors. It's not only family metaphors, but you will have family metaphor, print metaphor, and all other metaphor, one after another in a cluster in discourse, right? And then you'll have nothing for a long time, and then again a cluster of metaphors which will be mixed. That's the idea behind it, right? So this is not a characteristic which depends on a particular conceptual metaphor, in fact, but rather on metaphorization as an ability that is realized in discourse. So if we look at a previous example, the father of the nation appears together with something else, with an explanation. This is not a mixed metaphor, but there are others, and this one is not mixed as well. So, but please note this cluster, right? So all of this is an elaborated cluster of metaphors, and it appears only in that particular example, and then there will be nothing for a while, and then metaphors will cluster again, right? So certain clusters that appear tend to work based not only on conceptual factors, but in fact on factors that tend to be more linguistic and then conceptual but not necessarily metaphorical. So you've got this particular example where you start out with construction of democracy. You go on into construction of the nation, and then you go into social engineering here, which is also this sort of thing, right? So what happens in this particular example, it seems, is not only metaphorical clustering, but something that I will turn to next, and that's recontextualization. Using some sort of conceptual or, in fact, local, discursive, grammatical, linguistic element for what has previously been said, a multimodal element of what has previously been said, and then recontextualizing it, using it for your own purposes in a variety of ways in discourse. So let me go back really quickly to clustering here. In the nation corpus, there are about some 26% of metaphors that in fact appear in clusters. So 1/4 of the metaphors appear in clusters that are quite large. All of the other metaphors that are outside of clusters tend to be those one-off, very conventional, not one-off, but very conventional linguistic constructions. So clustering is another local discourse-based factor. And then finally, I want to turn to recontextualization. And what I want to claim here is that this recontextualization, remember the construction and social engineering, in fact creates emotional styles. So in previous examples, all of this clustering can in fact be seen as a type of recontextualization. What recontextualization means is that you use, more or less creatively, some content on the base of some other content that has been created before. Something that you use, something that you have heard, seen, and then you use it in your own context or in your own discourse, referring back to what has been said. This context of recontextualization, or in fact entextualization and some other examples, some other notions, comes from Bauman and Briggs, but it has been used in conceptual or in discourse metaphor theory as well. It has been shown as typical in online communities. So if you've got an online community, say of YouTube users who are following somebody, some influencer, they will have, or other platforms, not necessarily YouTube, but Le Pen did her study on YouTube, you will see that recontextualizing previous content is a typical thing that appears in online communities, and then it has been shown to be typical in metaphorical discourse as well, quite relatively recently by Simin, Ordain, and a little more. And a colleague of mine and I have seen that it's also used in metaphorical play, but I will not be showing these examples. Well, I will be showing these examples. In fact, this is an example of metaphorical play. So in this particular example, you've got a metaphor that is a result of previous recontextualization. So what happens is this. So what if someone is from a mixed marriage, i.e. half Slovene and half Macedonian, and then metaphor happens? Well, he is Bosnian because he's halfway between the two. So this is metaphor, or in fact, conceptual integration to be real. It in fact needs all of these elements coming in here. So this metaphor is possible because of a local factor, and this local factor is recontextualizing what has previously been said and using it metaphorically in your own discourse, right? So this is one type of recontextualization. There are others as well, where in fact you start out with one metaphor and then it changes and goes along and changes and you end up with something completely different at the end. So in this example, the metaphorical recontextualization is used for a humorous effect, and more generally speaking, metaphorical recontextualizations are used to support or contest previous conceptualizations. So let's have a look at another one where there is a lot of change here. So this is the Croatian, and I'll switch into English now, but please have a look at the Croatian. We've got, možda stvarno jednog dana budemo svi samo građani svijeta, pa možda sve dok nas drže izdijeljene u torovima, right? This is related to nations being divided up, so to speak. And then u torovima refers to izdijeljene, which gets recontextualized as ovce, jer su uvidjeli koliko su u stvari ovce, which gets recontextualized as samo stada za šišanje i pljačkanje, right? So to go back to go to the English part here, to keep us apart in sheepfolds. They realize that they are nothing but sheep, nothing but herds to be sheared and robed. So that's the idea. So we start out with one sort of a, well, it is a metaphor in fact. And then this metaphor gets recontextualized and used in a variety of ways in this single, in fact, metaphorical cluster in an online community, right? So this is, in fact, another local factor which influences metaphor. So you can contest and support previous conceptualizations through metaphor. You can create a discursive practice whereby previous conceptualizations are in fact appropriated for some sort of an emotive, affective effect. And what I call this affective effect is an emotional style. So these online communities tend to use the same way of doing these things. And these same ways of doing these things is something, a same evaluation of reality, let's say. And what I call this is an emotional style. I took it from Gamer, where he defines it as the experience, fostering, and display of emotions oscillating between discursive patterns and embodied practices, as well as between common scripts and specific appropriations. So, all in all, this is a local rather than a global practice because it appears in a particular discourse community for a particular communicative purpose. So I'll turn to the discussion and outlook now. Metaphor is a shared global ability to metaphorize. However, the local pressures in this metaphor, be they linguistic, constructional, discursive, or sociocognitive, should not be glossed over. They are crucial, in fact, in how metaphor functions. And it is only in the combination of the local and the global that, in fact, metaphor can work. The local-global dyad must include, I claim, grammar, discourse, and a broadly taken sociocognitive grounding. So the sum of the local pressures may bring about a post hoc fiction of globality in certain cases, which may be an epiphenomenon in some cases, but may not necessarily in some others. Some other global conceptualizations seem to be something that we really need to some extent. Okay. So metaphor, in fact, is also a way to build an emotional style. And I glossed over it, and I want to show you just one other example of how metaphor works as a way to build an emotional style. What I claim is that metaphor has an affective value as well, and a function that can be therapeutic. A function that does not depend on the conceptual content of metaphor, but only on the fact that you are using a metaphor to vent your emotions. And what happens in online communities is that you vent your emotions through different metaphors, but keeping the same emotional style, keeping the same affective value of the metaphor. And here's an example from a little bit of a discourse on Trump from HuffPost, where different and this is a short article on Trump's already small circle of trusted advisors suffering another big blow because Attorney General Jeff Sessions can no longer protect the president from investigations involving Russia. Please note that HuffPost comments are in fact curated comments. So this means that certain things in this online community get removed, right? So whether this affective style, emotional style, is in fact something that is being built externally or internally, we really don't know. But here are several comments. A second Russian shoe has dropped. The dominoes will fall one by one. The smoke will become a small campfire, then combust into a huge USA bonfire, and they will ask for attorneys when the full weight of the US Constitution comes crashing down on them. Welcome to the Karma Cafe, says another. Have a seat. There's no menu. You will be served what you deserve. This is a travesty, and the main culprit in this house of cards isn't long from his own demise. Tick, 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 coming soon to the station near you, and there are many others. So what we see here is in fact a common emotionality, a common emotional style behind them, but different metaphors, more or less metaphorical. And they are used, I claim, as a therapeutic way of venting your emotions and belonging to an online community. So metaphor is also a way to build an emotional style and can have an effective evaluative function independent of conceptual content, which I call the therapeutic function. And these metaphorical recontextualizations may in fact be brought about by metaphorical play with a common emotional style and multimodal metaphors that I didn't have time to show here, can also bring about emotional styles. This is quite visible with various memes and other things like this. So that's it. Thank you very much.